Hello, my name is Ben Walters. Here is a discussion I had with Nambucca Valley Councillor David Jones. He also drives for community transport, and some of his stories are derived from conversations he has while transporting people around the valley. It was made for my radio show Hinterland, broadcast on Nambucca Valley's community radio station 2NVR 105.9. Please enjoy.
G'day, David.
G'day, Ben.
Yeah, mate, so you told me that you picked up an interesting old fella who used to be from Missabotti.
Well, it's interesting because, picked up a guy who was taking him up to the hospital, and he was about 90 years old. And he was telling me he grew up in Missabotti, because I asked people now, I said, well, where did you grow up and all? And he said, Missabotti. So the ears are pricked up. And I said to him, what was it like, back in the day when you were a kid up at Missabotti? And he said, well, the fascinating thing was that the river, even back then, was so much better than now. And he can remember as a kid, 80 years ago, swimming in what we'd call a billabong, if you like, at the corner of the bend in the river. And it was 20 or 30 foot deep and crystal clear, and you could see the fish down the bottom. But then he went on to say that when he was, 10, 80 years ago, his great-grandfather was still alive. His great-grandfather was always of the opinion that it was the Cedar Getters, who effectively ruined the forest and ruined the river. And the logic he was saying, they were so disrespectful. They cut down all the red cedar. They trashed anything that, the small ones, they just cut them down out of spite because they knew they were slow growing. But he was saying
they didn't want the next person to make a buck out of it?
Well, they knew that, by the time...
It was no use to them.
They wouldn't have lived long enough so they just trash it, I mean, a lot of these things when there's no regulation. But anyway, so he was saying that his grandfather was saying that the removal of those big trees and the ways they went about it just destabilised the mountainside. Like they went right up into the valley, right up into the hinterland, The water quality dropped, a lot of silt started coming, the pebbles started coming in the river. And he turned to me at one stage and he just said this classic comment. He said, rocks and silt don't run uphill, So all of the river back in the day, you could take boats up to Boat Harbour in Taylor's Arm, the ferry could get up to Barraville, all this sort of stuff. So all of the degradation of the river, here we have a first-hand experience of someone telling us about his childhood and his great-grandfather telling the story of how the river was degraded. And when you think about it, it just makes so much sense. It just brings to life, this oral history brings to life what we talk about. So I just thought it was a fascinating example of that changes to the river. And so there you go, amazing.
And this points to what you were talking about before with the actual estuary at Nambucca Heads. Sometimes there's talk about it being silted up, and you have mentioned a lot of times that you think that it's from further up that a lot of the alluvial material has got there from these hills.
Well, that's a message that this gentleman was saying, and I just thought it was just, he was quite passionate about it. You could tell he was really upset about what had happened to the river. His childhood river had gone, and he didn't pull any punches, like he was saying that the whole argument about dredging the river down at Nambucca he says it's just madness. What they need to do is stop, degrading the forest, stop treating it like a endless resource. But not only do they wreck the forest, but the flow-on of our forestry behaviour for the last 200 years is a series of costs, and the benefits have been few and far between, but our attitude to it is still going on. So this was that story coming from someone of 90 years of age, and I just thought it was really powerful.
Well, this is a very old story in terms of colonial history, and you and me would love to talk to Gumbaynggirr people, with older stories again.
Yeah.
But this is about as old as it gets in terms of white history. We've got 90 years old talking about his grandfather, and that land that was cleared of red cedar must have subsequently been logged from other stuff.
Yeah.
And what's interesting to me is that I would have thought, the red cedar impacts were just, boutique, logging, and maybe there were just one tree here or there. And this is a very different picture, that it was a really desolation. Even when we're not talking about industrial logging, we're talking about bullock and cart, we're not talking about chainsaws, we're talking about crosscut saw, axes, and we're talking about one species, and we're still talking about mega destruction, and not just to the bush, we're talking about everything.
It'd be fascinating to talk to some of the Indigenous elders about their experience and their oral history of that. The other thing around the degradation, see, we know that as the cedar gatherers went up, the pastoralists and the farmers followed them, So the land was changed. The use of the land was changed. That natural environment that was there was never replaced. It never came back. So as they moved up, the damage got worse and worse and worse, if you like, as the landscape changed.
I guess maybe these impacts on the river systems would have got worse the more marginal, the steeper the valley. You would imagine that you're doing more and more damage once you go onto those steeper slopes.
Well, that's right. And erosion is an insidious thing. As soon as you break, ability of the landscape to maintain the moisture, release it slowly. As soon as it starts to rapidly run off, the velocity goes up, its ability to carry material goes up exponentially. We know that. If you double the speed of water, it doubles the amount of silt it can carry. You double it again, it goes up 4 times. Look how much silt goes out to sea every time we have a big event here. There must be thousands of tonnes. Well, thousands of tonnes are getting dropped in the river as well. And, one of the great myths about the river mouth is, if we just had a good rain, it would clear it out. It's actually quite the opposite. Every time we get a good... But it's just one of these myths. From the day I got here, you'd walk down the V-wall and people say, if we had a good rain, it would clean out the river mouth. And we'd get this bucketing 14 inches of rain in 24 hours, and I'd be looking at this silt and gravel coming down the river thinking, it's not working this time. The first thing I think we should do is have a really hard look at the logging practices. Secondly, I think we have to look at the riparian zone and getting vegetation right along there to stop the erosion. They're both things that point at erosion, and there are other benefits as well, but I think that's a place to start. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks for talking to us.